Robert, for the last couple of years, you've really been looking into political violence ever since the January 6th attack back in 2021. Your study has found a lot. Talk to me a little bit after you've been conducting this research over the past couple of years, and we've seen many instances happen, even from the shooting on the baseball field involving congressional leaders to just seeing what took place yesterday involving the former president.
That's right. So, starting in the spring of 2021, I started to conduct national surveys of support for political violence in the United States, looking at the 270 million American adults that live in the country. And what we found right from the beginning is a significant amount of support for political violence in the mainstream. We found nearly 5 to 10% of American adults were supporting political violence to restore Donald Trump to the presidency over that 3-year period of time. It has ebbed and flowed. And we now find that 10% of American adults support the use of force to stop Donald Trump from becoming president. Now, that does not mean that they will all pick up a gun and they will all use violence, but that support for political violence in the mainstream and also happening for causes on the right and on the left is underneath a lot of the political violence that we've been experiencing in our country. You talked about lone wolf attackers. Well, many of them have believed they have a mantle of legitimacy because they see significant support for aggression and anger, if not direct political violence in the United States. We saw 7 to 10% of the George Floyd protests were riots. Those folks thought they had legitimate reasons to riot. We saw the January 6th riot against the Capitol. Those folks thought they had legitimate reasons to riot. We saw the pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas protests, a fraction of which were storming buildings and throwing bricks at so forth and so on. And those folks thought they had legitimate reasons to be acting violently. Well, what's underneath all that is support in the general body politic for political violence. And so what you are seeing is in a whole variety of ways in our country, the more there's mainstream support for political violence, the more we're actually seeing political violence. And it's happening in a variety of different ways in the last few years. And this is all completely different than the period before the pandemic. So you'd have to go back to the 1960s to see anything like this degree of repeated, much even one instance, but repeated instances of significant political violence over and over and over again. So what happened yesterday is simply the latest. It's an actual escalation now. We haven't seen a assassination attack on a president since 1981. So this is just showing how much we are going back and things are happening with political violence that we have not seen in our lifetimes, and it's getting worse. So the hope that all this will just kind of fade away, that politicians can let their constituents kind of get some of the anger out and vent it, and this will all just kind of dissipate. This is just not happening here. So we just need to realize this is all getting worse, and we're heading into the most consequential election period in our lifetimes. And that's no accident. The more intense the political environment becomes, the more likely there is to be anger, and the more likely it is that anger can spill over into political violence. And we've got to now start to take this really seriously. Instead of just forgetting, well, okay, it's been, 3 days since the last event of political violence. I guess we can go back to watching baseball. I love baseball. I wish our Cubs and Sox were doing a little bit better than they were. But the fact of the matter is, this is not just going to get better on its own. And this is really a precarious moment for our democracy.
Robert, how did we get here? You're talking about acts of violence from more than 40 years ago, rearing its ugly head once again. How did we get to this point? I mean, we're now seeing what took place in the 60s and the 70s and the early 80s right now, which really kicked up in 2021. and now it has continued and it has progressively gotten worse. How did we get to
There
this
are some
point?
superficial similarities to what's happening today to what happened in the 1960s. So we're fighting in the 1960s a foreign war, a very controversial foreign war in Vietnam. Here, there's a very controversial foreign intervention where we're involved. We're not have boots on the ground, but in Gaza. Also with respect to Ukraine. We also have a situation where we have a wounded president, Lyndon Johnson in 1968. Joe Biden here. Now, he's not as wounded as President Johnson, but that you also have in 68 the Democratic Party in a crisis. Well, here we have a Democratic Party in crisis. So these are all the similarities, but some of the root factors are very different. The big thing that's happening, Darius, today that was not happening 10, 20 years ago is our country is going through a significant demographic transition. We are going to a transition where we're going from a white majority democracy to a white minority democracy. Right now, about 62% of Americans are white. If you had gone back 30 years, that would have been 82% would have been white. So this has not always been this way. And this demographic change has been happening for years and actually for decades. But we're at the tipping point of change. Now, some parts of the country don't want that change. And that's why immigration, by the way, is such a big issue. Some parts of the country want that to stop, that change to stop. They want to freeze things where they are as much as they can. Another part of the body politic wants that change to continue and maybe even speed up. That's why you have the folks who want to stop immigration 100% and others who want to open the gates as fast as possible and have as many come in as possible. So you're getting a lot of political anger around this major demographic change. And this demographic change is going to go on for about another 10, 15 years. So this is where Donald Trump came from in the first place. And this is why his movement is growing. This is why there's consternation here on the left that this change is not going to happen or not happen fast enough. And this is what's at the bottom of a lot of the intense politics that we're seeing. So this is not simply a matter of technology with social media, although that plays a role. It's not simply a matter of elite rhetoric, although that clearly plays a role. It's not simply a matter of not distributing wealth, although that plays a role. All of those other factors play a role, but they're playing roles in the context of a structural change in our country, which will have permanent consequences for the politics of our country. And that's where the energy is really what's really this is about. And that's why it's really important that our political leaders here not just keep thinking this is all they can duck this or bypass it or not going to criticize their constituents for being supporting political violence. It's okay to criticize somebody else's constituents or the other party. We really need to recognize we're going through a crisis in our American democracy. And this is a manifestation of this crisis, what we just saw yesterday, and these continuous hopes that everything is just going to fade away is just simply unrealistic given the dynamics I just explained.
Was that the hope back in 1981 that all of this was going to fade away and go away after the
Well,
last
in
attempted?
19, see, the big driver, or at least there were two big drivers of all that chaos in the 1960s. One is the Vietnam War with conscription, where people were not volunteering to go to Vietnam, they were being forced to go to Vietnam. And some of them just ran away to Canada, for example, rather than do that. The other was the real change away from the Jim Crow laws, the real problems that we had with the civil rights situation in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, which really was changing in the 1960s. So these two things together along with other factors such as more rights for women, especially sexual reproductive rights and so forth. So I don't mean to limit these to just these one, two, and only two factors. There are a variety of things coming together, but these two big factors, the issue of the Vietnam War and conscription and the issue of civil rights for minorities, these were the big drivers then, not so much demographic change. And that's why when the Vietnam War just disappeared, it just went away, and also when there really were some meaningful changes in our voting rights laws, you saw a dramatic decline of violence and turmoil, so that that just simply came to an end. And I don't mean to say these issues 100% came to an end, but nonetheless, that's why things stopped. Here, with the demographic change I'm explaining, this is going to go on for more years, Darius. This is not ending just with this election. What we are seeing is that as the demographic changes continue and the consternation about that gets worse and worse, our politics is getting worse, the violence is getting worse, and this is the real crisis in our democracy.
This may be a hard question to ask, but is there any other country that has gone through what we are going through, where they've had a change in demographics, a rise in political violence, things escalating to where they are to this day right here in the United
This is
States?
actually quite a common thing that happens, not all the time, but happens in other countries we wouldn't quite put on par with the United States. So think Bosnia in the 1980s, think Lebanon in the 1960s, 50s and 60s. These are areas I studied here before. I'm an expert, leading expert in international political violence. Now I've been focusing on American political violence in the last few years, more recently. Well, that demographic change is something that has happened in those other areas of the world. Think Lebanon. Why has Lebanon just been at its, pulling itself apart? A lot of it is demographic change of Christian, Shia, and Sunnis. Well, here in the United States, we had immigration as an issue in the 1920s, and that produced the rise of the second KKK, which from 1920 to 24 went from a few 100,000 members to 6 million members in just 4 years over immigration issues as a central cause. Now, countries besides the Lebanon and Bosnia, if you look at Canada today, if you look at France today, you look at Germany today, they too are having demographic change a little further out than we are. So it's not all happening to the countries, the mature democracies in the world at the same time. But fundamentally, the United States was the world's first genuine democracy 248 years ago. And we're now becoming the world's first truly multiracial democracy. Other countries, Canada, France, Germany, other countries are going through a similar transition, but we are the leading edge of that transition for those mature democracies.
How is social media playing a factor, especially when it comes to the spread of misinformation?
Yeah, it makes it worse. It pours gasoline on a fire, but the fire could well be there without social media. Now, we can't say 100% for sure because we can't run an experiment in the world where we take out social media and then rerun everything. However, we can look in our data. In our data, we can look at those really aggressive minorities in the United States that I was explaining to you. And we can say, where do they get their news from? And overwhelmingly, 90% of those radicalized minorities get their news from mainstream news sources. Yes, some get their news from the dark corners of the internet. And yes, when they do that, they become much more likely to be part of those radicalized minorities. But you could take that portion away, they would only be like 10% of those radicalized minorities, and you'd still be left with the main substance of what I'm describing. And so that's why this is social media is like pouring gasoline on a fire, but it's not likely the fire itself.
Robert, what else should I be asking you? I know you're a wealth of knowledge, and this is unprecedented what's happening right now, or at least We haven't seen it in more than 40
So
years.
this is a moment. What has just happened is a moment of potential unity. I can't say that it's going to be easy to do what I'm about to say, but we've seen some glimmers of it. The crucial thing that should happen and needs to happen to hold our country together, especially in the next 6 to 9 months, is for political leaders on both sides of the aisle to condemn violence if it's supported by their side. Not, it's been easy for Republicans to condemn violence that's coming from the left, or it's been easy for Democrats to condemn violence coming from the right, say January 6th. The hard thing is for political leaders to condemn violence coming from their own side. But this is absolutely critical. So it's Joe Biden, who's running for president, has just given speeches which effectively are talking to the Democrats and the Democratic side of the House more than anybody else to sort of tamp down the rhetoric. Well, some other Democratic leaders have followed suit, but what we need is we need powerful statements, not just by Joe Biden, but by Governor Pritzker, by Mayor Johnson. And this needs to be repeated, and it needs to not shy away from the fact that some of their own constituents can have this anger against Donald Trump. Well, the goal should be not to tell those constituents not to be angry, but to redirect their anger from violence to voting. The crucial thing is for politicians to say, yes, I'm angry too, but what we should do with that anger is vote. So if you don't like Donald Trump and you're worried about what he would do to the country, the idea is to take that anger and redirect it toward a landslide victory against Donald Trump. If you're in favor of Donald Trump and you think you're worried about the left, then you should redirect that anger against the left toward a landslide, working toward a landslide victory for Donald Trump. This is the way our democracy can function legitimately and legitimately settle disputes. But we've got to start using this language. We got to start saying, well, everybody knows I'm not in favor of political violence. Well, I'm sorry, but for 4 years now, we have had patterns of political violence we have not experienced in our lifetimes. This is just continuing. So the time for, thinking this is all just going to fade away on its own because we all know we are good people. We've got to start expressing it this way, and this will be extremely important in starting now through the next few months.
I think I have two final questions. Um, what will the impact be if that condemnation isn't necessarily clear or isn't necessarily laid out from
The
lawmakers on
real
both
risk,
sides?
so given the radicalization of the two parts of the body politic that I just explained, the real risk is we'll get spiral effects that we're going to get, for example, with the assassination attempt against Donald Trump, we'll start to get retaliatory political violence against Democrats and Democratic leaders. We can start to see spirals of political violence that can occur. So, and this is going to be something that once those spirals start to occur, this is going to be extremely hard to control and put those genies back into the bottle. And so this is not like, oh, yes, we will simply have a police officer stationed or a SWAT team stationed on every street corner. There aren't enough police to station somebody at every street corner and have SWAT. That would be an armed garrison state, by the way. So these choices of what's in front of us are not good. If we just let this go, then what you're talking about are spirals. You're talking about increasing militarization of ordinary. We've seen some of this. Remember George Floyd protests? We had to have all these police downtown and they were there for months. Well, this can get even worse and it can be even longer and it can go into other parts of the city. So these futures are not good futures. And these really do explain that there are really serious risks right now if we just let things go and say, well, they're just going to fade away on their own. No, it's important for political leaders now to make these statements.
Robert, with your expertise, with your research, what message do you have to the American people right now as many people look at what is playing out in our democracy?
The big message for the American people is that we have to not think about those times when we've been at having lunch or having coffee and snickering when something bad happens to our political opponent. Oh, gee, wouldn't it be too bad if Donald Trump died in prison? Snicker, snicker, snicker. Or or wouldn't it be too bad if something bad happened to President Biden? Snicker, snicker, snicker. So these have been happening in these small conversations here for long periods of time now. And people want to think, and we see them on TV, by the way, as well. And people want to think, well, they can say these things and they'll kind of laugh and it'll be kind of a half laugh and so forth. And then say, oh, well, of course, everybody knows I don't really mean that. I'm just kind of snickering about this. Well, that kind of snarky behavior is what it means to visibly be supporting political violence. And I'm not trying to say people saying that actually are supporting political violence, but it's easy for others to come to that conclusion. And that's what has been happening way too much in our democracy. And we just need to stop that behavior and just recognize that kind of snarky behavior, which probably is worse because of social media, is actually now having poisonous effects on our democracy. And this is not going to lead to good results for our country. Our democracy is in crisis, and it's not just the fault of one political leader. It's not just the fault of one technology. This is something that's happening across our body politic. And we now need to recognize that we all can play a role in changing this trajectory.